It is election season, which means that those who want to be our elected representatives are making a lot of speeches and a lot of promises, whether it's on TV debates or in manifestos or in the letters that are coming through the door. Lots of promises. Meanwhile, the same politicians are also often pointing out where their rivals have failed or forgotten to keep their promises. Promises are an interesting concept. A promise is a commitment to do something, to make something happen. It's quite easy to make a promise. It's not always as easy to keep that promise, to make sure that whatever that is happens. When someone in my family starts to say that phrase, I promise, I usually jump in and try and stop them, because I've learned painfully from my own experience of failing to keep promises that it's so easy to say the words I promise, but having to follow through later on isn't always so easy. So my advice is, don't make rash, quick promises at the drop of a hat, especially just to try and get out of doing something today maybe. Promises that are broken are more than just disappointing. They risk wearing away at trust in a relationship. So I suggest being careful with promises, or by talking about more honest things about what you might want to do or try to do. And that's not to say that I never make promises. One of my friends, his name is Paul, and he's also a minister. He is great in that he talks about how he's made 3 sets of promises in his life: to his wife at their wedding, to his children at their baptism, and to the church as a minister. And he doesn't put one above the other. He lets them all weigh equally on him, not putting one above the other. And that means he's good at being able to say no at the right time. One of my joys as a minister, and that word minister means servant, is that I get to wrestle with a collection of books that we call the Bible. A collection collected in this book, but not just a book, it's a whole collection. As I've said before, it's written maybe around about over 1,000 years. The different parts have come together, and it's written by at least 40 different writers or editors or artists. It's a collection of all sorts of writing. And I've argued that in there, even though there are hundreds of stories, there is at the same time a big story. And that story is a family story, a love story, a justice story, and a promise story. There's one book in this collection that begins with a line that hints straight away about promises. That book is called Luke, and that writer says that others have tried to put together an account about something he or she calls the things that have been fulfilled among us. The things that have been fulfilled among us. What sort of things get fulfilled? Well, promises get fulfilled. And the assumption of this book that we call Luke is that promises have been made. Interesting. And here, right in the first line, he's saying promises have been fulfilled. And not just fulfilled anywhere, but among us. That word us is a powerful word too. You see, the other thing that things like elections can highlight is a tendency to talk not about us, but about them, or to highlight both and say them and us and draw some clear lines and boundaries, walls, barriers between groups of people. In God's story in the scriptures, in this particular book called Luke, something has happened, he says, among us. I wonder if you right now are feeling part of the us or part of the them. I'm a great believer, and I think Luke is too, in that there is no them. I've come to realise that there really is no them, there is only us. But that's getting ahead of ourselves in Luke's story. That's only one of the things that his book is going to be about. The us that Luke is particularly talking about is a new group, a new movement of people in the first century who are trying to live out the way of a young Jewish teacher called Jesus of Nazareth. And this book that we call Luke is one of 4 accounts of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And he operated around 2,000 years ago in first century Palestine. From pretty early on, although this book doesn't tell us who wrote it, it was assumed that a man called Luke was the writer, and that he may well have spent some time with a man called Paul. He also wrote another book called Acts. Paul himself writing lots of letters in this collection. No one knows for sure who wrote this, but that is actually as good a theory as any. What we do know from reading it is that this writer was well educated, really good at all different kinds of Greek, probably not Jewish himself, but knew a lot about the Jewish scriptures. And he says that this account, he gives an introduction, has been written for someone called the Most Excellent Theophilus. Theophilus was probably a real person. He may well have funded Luke's project. But even if he's not a real person, even if he's a fictional character that Luke presents his story to, that name in Greek, Theophilus, means lover of God. Lover of God. That was a title used for those who were outside the Jewish tribe. This audience is an outsider in some ways. Luke himself is probably an outsider, not a Jew. And in his book, he's going to take his listeners on a journey. He says from the beginning, he's going to go right back. And he's going to remind them that this God has made promises and has always kept those promises, unlike so many, unlike God's people themselves. He's also going to display that in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, it becomes clear how God is at work and always has been at work and always has had a bigger picture about who the us means. Luke doesn't go as far as saying that other accounts that are out there and that can be checked about the Jesus story are not as well put together as his, but he does emphasize just how carefully this has been ordered, how the eyewitnesses that he's talked to, the servants of the word that he talks about, and a word for ministers, those who had the authority to tell the story, have all been carefully with him investigated. And now he's put it into an order to get across what he wants to get across, because he wants them to have a strong foundation for the way that they're trying to live out. We're pretty sure he was writing this around about 60 to 80 AD. So there would still have been plenty of people around who could remember the kind of things that Jesus of Nazareth had said and done. So why write this down at all? Well, around the same time, a Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire had seen a big reaction in over 4 years from AD 66 to AD 70. There were terrible fighting, skirmishes, and the Roman Empire brutally put that movement down, leading to the destruction of their city, capital city Jerusalem, and their temple, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The towns and the people who had heard and seen Jesus in action were being scattered. The towns were disappearing. And so it's precious for Luke, among others, to collect this material together for it to be passed on. Because as the ruins of the city are still smoking and the temple is now a pile of rubble, the Jewish people are asking some deep questions about what's happened to their God, to the promises he made that they might be a blessing to all nations. And yet now they sit here in the wreckage with their questions and their longings, asking, who are we? And what are we supposed to do? Who are we? And what are we supposed to do? Luke thinks that in his Jesus story, he has some of the answers. I wonder, as we journey with him, what your response will be.